It's also a violation of American law to send U.S. weapons to a country that is violating international law. In this case, violating international humanitarian law. Using food as a weapon of war is a clear violation of international law
with no ambiguity.
with no ambiguity. In my view, it's a moral imperative that U.S. taxpayers not be complicit in starving civilians in Gaza.
Senator Van Hollen, I appreciate your time today. There was a vote to block U.S. aid to Israel. You were on the list of Senate Democrats who voted yes to block U.S. military aid to Israel. And I want to talk about your vote. I want to talk about what the block was for. And I also want to ask you up front about the Senate Democrats that voted no. But let's take this one step at a time. What were you voting for specifically?
Well, Jolly, what I was voting for is very straightforward, that U.S. taxpayers should not be financing the transfer of offensive weapons to the Netanyahu government while the Netanyahu government is using food as a weapon of war. And you have literally starving people all over Gaza who can't get a meal and are going hungry, and some have died of starvation, as I pointed out on the Senate floor. So this is a really important moment. In my view, it's a moral imperative that U.S. taxpayers not be complicit in starving civilians in Gaza.
100%. And I like to point out what a lot of people on social media have pointed out, that this is not just starving people. I mean, this is flat out famine. There's no access to food. It didn't get there overnight. And I think that what you're saying is the Netanyahu government is completely complicit in how it got here.
Well, that's right. We had another similar vote like this. I believe it was back in April, right after the Netanyahu government imposed a total blockade on food in Gaza, a total blockade. Now they're letting a little trickle, not nearly enough to address the famine that's upon us. And so I also said at that time, U.S. taxpayers shouldn't be sending offensive weapons to the Netanyahu government while they are essentially preventing food into Gaza. We need to use our leverage to stop this starvation and this famine that you're talking about, not to fund it or to somehow subsidize it. This is a pretty straightforward moment, in my view. That's why it's important that we keep the focus on this issue. Look, Netanyahu and his government could end this starvation today by allowing the United Nations to simply resume the food distribution that was in place before they blocked it starting back in March.
1,000% agree with you. Your stance and my stance align here. There was a handful of Senate Democrats that said no to this vote. Now, I understand from having spent some time in Senate there in the Capitol building, the nuance of calling out your colleagues and the good order and discipline of the Senate. And I think a lot of times people on the internet are looking for you to yell at each other by name. Can you talk to us, number one, why these Senate Democrats would say no? And then number two, why we're not hearing you, who did say yes, call these other Senate Democrats out by name?
Well, first, I would say, Jolly, that I wish every Senate Democrat had voted to say we're not going to use American taxpayer dollars to go to the Netanyahu government while they're essentially blocking food from getting to people in Gaza. I wish it had been every one of our colleagues. I'm not going to, sugarcoat that.
Good.
And I guess if there's any good news in this vote, we had more Senate Democrats vote this time to prevent the transfer of offensive arms than we did just a few months ago. But it shouldn't take even more people starving before every Senate Democrat wakes up and says that this is an abuse of taxpayer dollars. America should not be complicit, period.
I agree with you that starvation, I mean, this is in everybody's face. This is level 5 famine. This is a problem. Even prior to it reaching this level, Israel was using the military aid that had been sent to them previous to bomb schools, to bomb hospitals, to commit blatant, egregious war crimes, to kill children to the tune of 15,000 innocent children in Gaza. Why has U.S. aid continued even through all that?
Well, Jolly, it's the right question to ask. And I have been, since the beginning here, voting against transferring offensive weapons to the Netanyahu government, not because they were not justified in going against Hamas when They were attacked on October 7th. They were justified, Israel, in defending themselves. But it's not justified to use weapons in an indiscriminate way that kills civilians, where you bomb schools and hospitals, and then you use food as a weapon of war. There's nothing that justifies that. So in my view, and again, I've been very clear from the very beginning on this, the United States cannot be complicit, and American taxpayers should not be funding this, period. And I hope that at this moment, we'll see more senators, certainly Democratic senators, taking that position. That's the moral position, but it's also in the interest of the United States. You can't have a position where you say you stand up for human rights around the world and then only condemn your adversaries when they abuse people's human rights. You lose credibility. You lose credibility and people see that hypocrisy. They say to America, why are you coming to talk to us about protecting human rights while America is financing the Netanyahu government's operation that is resulting in the starvation of kids? Don't come calling us out on human rights if you're not calling out the Netanyahu government. In my view, Jolly, is that if we're going to have any credibility with the United States when it comes to human rights, we need to be consistent, because otherwise people will see it as just a political tool. They'll see people using human rights as a political cudgel rather than as an underlying principle that we should all adhere to. And you can't have a principle if you're going to have one set of rules for the Netanyahu government and a different set of rules for everybody else. That doesn't work.
That's a whole word. Like, I got some goosebumps there. I mean, it's this idea of human rights for thee, but not for me. And that's not the way we should be. I agree with you completely. I appreciate you so very much for being on the right side of this, like you say, pretty clear, straightforward moral situation. And as we watch it, I would hope to follow up with you again in the future. And hopefully, eventually, we can get the rest of the Senate Democrats on board here. Stop sending U.S. aid to Israel.
Yeah, the only other point I would make, Jolly, it is definitely a moral moment. It's also a violation of American law to send U.S. weapons to a country that is violating international law. In this case, violating international humanitarian law. Using food as a weapon of war is a clear violation of international law.
With no ambiguity.
With no ambiguity, right? I mean, even Donald Trump, who's blind to almost everything, says this is starvation and you can't fake it. Here you have Bibi Netanyahu claiming there's no starvation going on when everyone can see it, and they can see he's lying through his teeth. But my point is, in addition to the moral outrage, it is a violation of U.S. law to be sending U.S. weapons to a government that is using those weapons in violation of international humanitarian law. And that's what we're doing. So we're complicit in these immoral actions, and we're in violation of U.S. law.